TFM.
This is J.G. Hertzler, General Martok on Deep Space Nine, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Welcome, Niners, to another episode of The Orb, our dedicated Deep Space Nine podcast. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me, as he always is my esteemed co-host, Matthew Rushing. And Matthew, I've been hanging out at the firehouse with the Ghostbusters, and they loaned me this trap we can put Odo in if he tries to disrupt our podcasting.
Good, finally, because I'm tired of him ruining every single take of our podcast. It's incredibly frustrating, and I don't know why he, won't stop. So,
but you got to give him credit. He's creative. Like sometimes he turns into a crow and just like caws in the corner. Sometimes he turns into a metal bucket and falls off my desk. I mean, at least he's creative. It is
funny when he does that. That's for sure. I like when he just randomly kind of rolls out. It's pretty funny.
It's like, what's going on behind me there on the floor? Oh, that Odo. Yeah. But it was funny that when they come on the station, Verad and his gang come on the station, and they pull out that trap. It just basically is a Muon trap from Ghostbusters, right? Like if the Ghostbusters told the ghost, could you just climb in there for a while?
That's pretty much what they're asking for.
All right, everyone, we're going to continue our 30th anniversary rewatch of Deep Space Nine today with episode 4 of season 2. It is Invasive Procedures, and here's a quick rundown of the story. With the station all but abandoned due to a plasma storm, a skeleton crew of Sisko, Kira, Jadzia, Bashir, Odo, O'Brien, and Quark, also known as names in the main credit sequence, are easily overpowered by an unjoined Trill hell-bent on sticking the Dax symbiont in his belly. This feeble man named Verad feels that he has been condemned to a life of mediocrity because he wasn't chosen for joining. If he could only have a symbiont of his own, all would be well, and his girlfriend would especially love him. Doing his research, he found that Dax was the ideal match, and so he came to the station with the help of Klingon mercenaries to take what he thinks is rightfully his. He almost succeeds, but made one fatal mistake. Never call me Benjamin. So, Matthew, this episode is an interesting one for me because I have to say it's never been one of my favorites, and yet it's among the favorites of some of the writers, including Ira. And something else I hadn't thought about initially, but if you watch it with these eyes, you can see exactly what they're doing, is that the genesis of this episode came when Michael Piller said, hey, could we do Key Largo, the 1948 Humphrey Bogart movie, on Deep Space Nine? And they did it. And it's not like a mirror copy of the plot, but there are a lot of similarities. Of course, they're all trapped on the station. There's a storm outside. Someone's coming for the girl. There's even this kind of like reminiscing about the past that goes on between Sisko and Verad after he's joined. And I think that that's one aspect of this episode that might make it work better in terms of the cohesion of the episode if you have that in mind when you watch it. I don't know. How do you feel about the cohesion of the episode? Because it's always felt a little bit disjointed to me. I
mean, do you mean with the setup for the rest of the story, in the sense of, the idea that they would have to basically empty the entire station because of this plasma storm.
Sort of. Like that part of the story doesn't quite make sense to me, because I feel like if there's a plasma storm going outside, it would be safer to huddle in that giant space station instead of getting in little ships and trying to go to Bajor.
Yeah, at least my understanding of the episode, it seemed as though, all of those ships had left before the plasma storm.
They knew it was coming.
Came.
Right.
And I also kind of got the sense that the reason that they did that was because they weren't sure how the station would handle it, right? And so one of the things we get in the episode, of course, is the line by Kira talking about how the Cardassians basically built this thing to last, and so it does seem like everybody would have been safe, but this is just a major precaution, not because you do get a sense that this isn't something that this is what you would do on like a normal starbase, or maybe a starship trying to avoid being caught in a plasma storm. And in fact, isn't Enterprise basically caught in a plasma storm?
Well, there's the catwalk episode where I don't know if they refer to it as a plasma storm precisely, but it's a relatively bad storm though.
Yeah, that they are caught in.
And they have to huddle. But of course that's a 22nd century ship, which is probably 100%. Not fortified against something like that very well. I think, getting off topic here with Enterprise now, but I think that episode was probably intended to portray something closer to home for us. Like right now, if we tried to send astronauts to Mars, what the radiation would be like and how you would have to protect yourself against it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And so, I do think that one of the interesting things then about this episode is that, and I don't know, I think it works relatively well, at least in my mind. And part of that is because this is kind of an intimate story just for our main characters, right? This is a story that is specifically revolving around O'Brien, Dax, Bashir, Sisko, and then Jadzia. And so, and that I think and then of course Quark is there because he's the catalyst for all of these bad things happening as per usual. And so I find that to be really, really interesting.
So you feel like it's effective to empty the station for this story, because I feel like they empty the station and they have the storm because Michael Piller had the idea of, why don't we do Key Largo on Star Trek? Whereas everything that happens in this story could still happen even if everyone who normally lives on the station and works on the station was there, because we see other stories where the central characters are involved in something of this sort without having to essentially have a ghost station around them.
Yeah, I think the thing about this, at least the sense that I get for this episode, it makes it easier for us to kind of be able to see what Jadzia means to these main characters, because that's the closeness level that we're trying to discover. As we're coming into the second, this really does feel like a second season episode, because that's what it's all about. Like, okay, what happens if we lose Dax? What happens to all of these people if we lose her? And, that becomes then the question, not only for Benjamin, but you think of the relationship that she has with Kira and the closest they've started to have, and of course you also, I think one of the main functions of this episode as well is the bonding that happens between Bashir and Jadzia. You have that, you can tell that even though he's been chasing her and everything, there is a closeness to the two of them that transcends that.
I think it's the first time that we see that, actually. I
100% agree with you.
Like an honest concern.
Absolutely.
Like a friendship and a like an emotional connection.
Yeah, I agree. No, I think you're 100% correct in that, and I think that's what actually makes, for me, this episode actually pretty special, is because we actually do get the opportunity to see that their relationship is so much more than that, and this episode helps us to get into that. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think what you're saying though is that this does make for a quite unique episode where there are really no extras, because all of the people that you need are there. And then there's nobody else. You know, there aren't any other side stories happening. So really, there's just an A story.
Yeah.
And the A story is just about the way in which it kind of impacts all of the characters involved, even the ones who are quote unquote guests. And that is, I would say, incredibly unique for Star Trek. We do not do that very often.
Right. It is very striking, especially for Deep Space Nine, but really for Star Trek in general. It's a very quiet episode. Like, it feels, I'm going to say the word hollow. I don't mean the story is hollow, but I mean like the environment, sort of the atmosphere feels empty because everyone's off the station, obviously. And the pacing and the dialogue and everything, it's quite slow, and it's quite a striking contrast with other DS9 stories. And also watching it this time, I was imagining, with the way television's done today and way Star Trek's done today, I just couldn't imagine a story being this quiet and paced in this way.
Yeah, which again, I think is one of the things that sets this episode apart. And I think it what you were talking about, where it kind of creates this sense of discomfort almost, where like, how does this all work? How does this all fit? And what it does, and I think this is one of the keys that we'll end up kind of talking about with this episode, is that if the episode doesn't kind of grab you and hold you and keep you with the performances and just the story itself, then this episode is probably going to feel a little bit hollow for the viewer. They're probably not going to enjoy this episode as much.
So, well, let's talk about Verad, because he comes aboard and he's after the Dax symbiote. And I think the way that John Glover plays Verad is quite effective. And Terry Farrell does the same thing with Jadzia, where the symbiosis with the symbiote seems to be very, very influential on personality. And before we get into too deep into that, Verad's motivation itself is that he feels like he's missed out on life. Like he was meant for more. He was rejected as a candidate for joining. And I picture him, the way that John Glover plays Verad at the beginning of the episode is, he probably wasn't always like he is now in terms of his demeanor and his presence and all, but he's a man who has over time felt more and more hollow because this is going to tie into what I want to talk about next, but he feels that there's something missing from him as a being because he's not joined. And then I also think that, you know, he's promised his girlfriend here all of these things and they haven't come true. And so he feels like he has failed her, and then he feels failed himself. And so he's like descending in terms of his demeanor and all, to the point where he almost comes across as like a very sad man at this point.
Oh, he is a sad sack Trill.
Yeah.
I really like where you're kind of going with this, because I think this is kind of the crux of the episode. And I think that it's one of those places where I see this episode speaking so much more today than even it did when it came out, which is this whole idea of, just because I didn't get the thing I wanted means that I can't ever be happy, or I can't ever live a full life. And I find that to be an incredibly interesting thing here for them to be discussing because, Verad uses this as his excuse to be able to do whatever he wants to do to get what he wants. Mm-hmm. It is the absolute expression of hyper individualism, mm-hmm. right? Which is, I will get whatever makes me happy at the cost of anyone and anything. And that's an incredibly, I think this episode shows how dangerous that type of life is, right? And because he's willing to murder somebody else to get what he wants. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I find so fascinating because everybody allows him, it seems like, to basically make this excuse instead of ever really challenging him. It's like, dude, you have a choice. You're pretending like you don't have a choice, but you actually have a choice. You could go live a full and happy life, but your choice has been to sit in your misery and wallow in it, mm-hmm. like a pig in slop. Mm-hmm. And that is your fault, not anybody else's. And that's what I find so fascinating about this episode. And it's actually one of the things that as I was watching it, I was actually enjoying the episode more because I was just seeing the ways in which it's so relevant in the world we live in today. Maybe, again, I think even more so than when it came out.
Yeah, right. And the longer you do that, the deeper in the hole you get. And
exactly,
that's what we see from him here. His motivations are initially presented as he's going to give a better life to his girlfriend, Mariel, and himself.
Right. Yeah.
He feels he can live up to who she expected him to be if he were joined. But once he's joined, mm-hmm. his devotion to her seems to waver. And even Sisko tells Mariel, you go talk to him. You don't believe that he's not doing this all for you. The other thing about that motivation is that, and I think this is something that I think enhances the episode a lot. And he comes back in a comic series from mm-hmm. 2001 called Divided We Fall, which was written by our friend David Mack and John Ordover. And the character that we see in this episode after he has the symbiont inside him and the way his personality changes, merging with the feeling that we see at the beginning where he feels like he was abandoned by not being mm-hmm. Chosen to join,
right,
leads him in that comic, Divided We Fall, to kind of on a rampage, and he becomes like a conspiracy theorist against the council on Trill. And I won't spoil the story. You can go find the comic. It was put out by Wildstorm, and I think it's available. Do you know did they ever reprint it?
I honestly don't know if they ever did or not.
Yeah, I don't know if they do, but it's available. I know if you look around online, you can probably find it somewhere. Yeah. But I know you can buy it if you look on Amazon or somewhere and look for. There was an old CD of all the classic Star Trek comics, mm-hmm. so that's where we got it from. But anyway, and go back and listen to Literary Treks 12, and you can find out more. But I just wanted to mention that because I think that what David does with the character of Verad later on, tying back into this episode, as well as episodes on the Next Generation, which involve the Trill, really makes this episode a lot more interesting when you watch the character. And you start to, for the first time, to like really delve into the inner workings of Trill joining.
Right. Well, and I think one of the things that is incredibly interesting then about this episode is the fact that we're utilizing it to talk about the relationships of the characters, which always makes for a great story. But we're also utilizing it as a way to explore a species that we haven't explored a ton of, because we have the character Jadzia. In fact, in many ways, Deep Space Nine will do that for a lot of the alien species, like the Cardassians and the Ferengi and the Klingons, and then, of course, the Trill, the Bajorans. I mean, all of these races are going to be explored in some serious depth because we're not moving around all the time, so we get the opportunity to be able to do that. And so what you get then is this understanding through Verad as to why certain people aren't chosen, because we can tell that he is not emotionally stable enough to be able to handle the transition that he would make with having the symbiote, because he's not stable enough to just be himself without it, which is, I think, one of the things that we see there. Like the conversation that he has with Jadzia, it's very clear that if she hadn't been chosen, she would have been fine. She would have found a way to move on with her life and still be very successful and very accomplished as she already is. And so the Dax symbiote actually just enhances her wholeness, right? And it's only when it's taken away that she has that empty feeling, because, of course, now she's so used to having all of these different lives inside of her. And so that's the thing that I find so interesting, because they're really, the writers do a great job in this episode of creating a clear difference between Jadzia and Verad. And we can then, because of that, clearly see why Trill society works the way that it does. And so I find that to be really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting that it played out that way, because Robert Hewitt Wolf, who has writing credit on this episode, has said about Invasive Procedures that they don't tend to write a lot of backstory for their characters until they need it for a story, for a plot to work. And so this whole setup put them in a position where, well, we have to think about how Trill society works and how Trill joining works. And so they did write this into the story. But I think the other thing that really makes it work here is Terry Farrell's decision on how to play Jadzia without the symbiont.
I agree.
So she decided, and she's talked about this in The Companion, that she decided to, play the character as this woman who had no problem giving up her life, giving up the symbiont and potentially her life to save everyone else, because the symbiont was giving her the confidence that everything's going to be okay. But once the symbiont was out, she realized that she's this 28-year-old woman who hasn't lived a lot yet, and she was very scared. And that made me start thinking about, well, okay, and remember, at this point, we don't know much about how Trill society works. Now, today in 2025, we know a lot, because even Star Trek Discovery has a whole Trill storyline to it. But at this point, we don't know much. What we do know from...
I don't know much, but I know I love you.
That's what Julian was singing to Jadzia.
And that baby, all I need to know. Oh, yes, that's exactly what he was saying.
But so at this point, based on what we're being told in this story, we know that there are very few Trill who are chosen to be joined. So then I start thinking about, well, you've got this whole society of people who aren't joined. So they must be living normal lives, right? They must have their own confidence and their own strength, and they live normal lives. They're not a planet full of people like Verad is portrayed as at the beginning of the story. And then so what that raises is how the symbiont influences the host. I called it one confident worm, because it seems that after joining, when the Trill host and the symbiont become more and more intertwined and accustomed to one another, like there's something, and I'm sure it stems from the long lifespan of the symbiont and the experiences of the past hosts, but there's this like injection of confidence that goes in that builds over time. And what's striking is that, well, it's striking in the abilities that gives to the host, but also how it impacts the host once the symbiont's gone. Now, it is mentioned in here that usually the host dies soon after the host is removed. So I suppose if that were really the case, the person wouldn't have to live with the loss of the confidence for too long, which is a sad thing to think about. But
yeah.
But anyway, just this whole idea, like they hadn't thought about this backstory very much up until this point, and then all this stuff comes pouring out here.
Yeah, I think what it really does is gives you an opportunity to understand just the intense dynamic then that exists between host and symbiont. And it does make sense. I think it's the same thing that we can do as we get older, right? And we think back on our lives and we're like, oh man, if I'd just known what I know now, right? But that's what happens then once you are given the symbiont, especially one like Dax, who's so long lived. You have years and years and years of experiences that give you a wisdom that becomes more than your age. You know, you legitimately become an old soul. And so it makes sense then as to why that would give you a confidence that would be difficult to have as a 28-year-old. I mean, how many, confident 28-year-olds do you know unless they've, made themselves a billionaire by that point, So,
and that doesn't mean they have any wisdom.
100%. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so I think that's what makes this so interesting is that it seems intuitive, right? Like, and I think maybe that might be the thing that really strikes me about this episode. And it's one of the things that I think really strikes me about a lot of what they do on Deep Space Nine in the writing is that the more you think about the things that they tell us about these different races based off of what's been already set up, the more it's like, oh, well, of course that makes sense. It feels very intuitive. And I think that really does show you how in tune that the writers are of Star Trek. I mean, I'm reading this book about the beginning of Voyager and its creation and everything. And by this point, I mean, all of these people have been on Star Trek for a very long time. Yeah. I mean, even McCluggage, who is the head of the studio, is somebody who, during the writing of the Caretaker episode, can question, are they doing the right thing for the Prime Directive here? So that just lets you know how many people in the studio have a clear understanding of what Star Trek is and what the canon of Star Trek is. And
what's come before as well. So it's referencing things that they themselves have been involved in instead of
100%
reading.
And so I think that's something that, again, when we talk about what's happening with the Trill here, it really just makes sense what they decide to add then to the Trill as characters and what we learn. And that's great because in the end, that really is good world building through worm building.
Exactly. And also that worm building leads us to learning more about the relationship between Benjamin, Sisko, and Dax.
Yes.
Through even it's very short, but it's, he leads Verad through to the fact that Jadzia is dying, right? And he does it by being chummy with him at first, appealing to the symbiont, and then breaking through to Verad and Dax as well. Yeah. And I think it's well played by Avery Brooks, and I like the way that the other crew members are, especially Kira's, looking at him like, I can't believe what he's doing. He's joking around but he has a goal. He knows where he's going. But there's so many things mentioned, like even just in that short moment, we build a lot of history for Benjamin that we can call on down the road, but he becomes a more fleshed out person, and that relationship does as well.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that that's something that the writers here are very keen on. And it's definitely clear that it's the thing that, Michael Piller and then Ira Stephen Bear bring to Deep Space Nine, because, it wasn't really until Piller came on the Next Generation where characters became more of the focus. And, Bear, who had worked on TNG, was always the person who was kind of frustrated that they couldn't go even more character focused. And so I think that's the thing that Deep Space Nine has really dug into, which is this idea of we are really going to explore the characters, but we're also going to explore the world that we have created for Star Trek. And this is one of the ways that they do that. And I think, as we were kind of talking about at the beginning, this is one of the reasons why they empty the station, to allow us to not have anything take away from the focus of the world building that they're doing for the characters and, for then, of course, the Trill in general.
Right, right. Now, some of the characters here feel, well, not too much, but there's one thing that strikes me as being particularly out of character for Kira, and that's the fact that
I'm glad you're going to mention this.
And that's the fact that she quickly gets her ass kicked by a prostitute from Kafka 4. And
you mean a comfort specialist?
A comfort specialist. I'm sorry. Yes. Sorry. I misplaced her business card. And right. So that was hard for me to believe that a woman who helped drive away the Cardassians from the occupation, couldn't hold her own against this woman, especially this woman and the way that she's portrayed. Now, I really like Megan Gallagher, and she comes back, of course, in Little Green Men, which is where I remember her from mainly. But she works really well in that episode as Faith Garland, but I don't think she works so well in this episode as kind of a mercenary type who's helping take over the station. And when she fights Kira, when she pins Sisko, I have trouble buying it.
So I think that she works perfectly as the companion for Verad.
Yeah, I agree on that. Yeah.
Seeing her as kind of this person who's going to take down Kira, that's a different story. In fact, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because it didn't really make sense that she would be somebody who would take advantage of Kira in that way. I mean, we know Kira is an incredibly scrappy fighter who's been fighting all of her life. And again, like you mentioned, yes, they call her, they gave, him comfort, but yes, she's a prostitute. Yeah. That's what she was. And he saved her and all. But I don't think that means that she would be able to take down a resistance fighter who has been fighting that fight like Cassian Andor since she was like 6 years old, right? Yeah. I just don't see that happening.
And we see she can take down Cardassians in their armor, right? She can fight them, knock them out, but no match for this comfort specialist.
Well, but on the other side, we see Sisko taking down a Klingon, which was great.
Yeah, which is a lot more believable, though.
True, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, otherwise, I think the characters are pretty accurate and believable in this episode.
Yeah, I agree.
Quark does something where there are some real consequences or there are almost some real consequences to what he does by disabling the security, allowing the station to be taken over in the first place, and then almost costing Jadzia her life. And the thing that he does is pretty in line with what we would expect from Quark, but the results of it are a bit more serious than what we're accustomed to. And Armin Shimmerman has said that that's one aspect of the story that he wasn't thrilled with in that, and he said this about a few other things as well that Quark has done. He doesn't like it when Quark does something truly bad that endangers others, and then he isn't punished for it. He doesn't face any real consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the interesting thing about the episode is that we definitely see that Quark does this thing that, yes, almost gets Jadzia killed, and other characters could have easily been killed. Mm-hmm. And I wish they had made, and this is where I think it would have helped, if they had made a little bit more explicit what Quark thought they were coming here for.
Oh, yeah, right.
Because
it's not clear, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So you get the sense of like Quark is thinking, oh, they're just coming to the station to get, who knows what. But, he doesn't have a clear understanding, because if it had been the whole, oh, we're coming to steal the symbiont from Dax, there's no way Quark would have done that, because
of course.
he really, he's got a thing for Dax. And so that's just not going to happen. So,
right.
And then I do agree with you too. It's like, there's also no follow up to this at all. And so it would have been interesting to see that. Of course, Quark is also one of the reasons in which they are able to, stop this in the first place, because of his ingenuity.
Yeah.
And so, but that doesn't negate what he did. And so, yes, I think there would have been some ways to kind of ameliorate this to make it better.
Mm-hmm.
Just by a couple of quick lines of dialogue, honestly.
Oh, yeah.
And so that would have been really interesting.
Just even one line to just clearly state why he's letting them on in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
The fact that he would disable security to let someone who's going to buy something from him or deliver something to him board the station, that's easy to believe. But yeah, it's another one of those things in here that seemed convenient for the plot. Just as the storm seems convenient to the plot, that it makes it so much easier for them to just board the station.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Now, he does face a little bit of consequence for this, in that he gets a long-running cold shoulder from Kira after this.
It's true. That is true. And, it's obviously well-earned, so.
The well-earned cold shoulder.
But, Chris, did you notice any, I don't know, how should we say, familiar faces in this episode?
Well, I did, but I will say that it's not so easy to notice. But there is one particular actor who, after he tried to rob the Enterprise in Starship Mine, but before he was part of Sulu's bridge crew in Generations, or Janeway's science officer, he played a Klingon here, and that's Tim Russ, as the ruthless Takar.
Yeah, I love that he's here. It's really interesting reading about the beginning of Voyager, and Tim Russ was one of the few that was super easy for them to cast, and that's because they really liked Tim Russ. Berman specifically really liked his voice. They thought he was a good actor.
And that goes all the way back to the TNG auditions when he auditioned for LaForge.
Exactly. And then, of course, they put him in these minor roles. He even got the role there in Star Trek Generations. And so he was one of those people who, and this happens, we see in the history of Star Trek, people come in, they audition, they don't get a role or whatever, but they like them. And so they continue to bring them back in all of these guest roles, which I just think is great. And so, he's very good as a Klingon here. You could almost see him playing a Klingon for the rest of his life, because he really does it well. And I kind of actually liked the way in which, he's a Klingon who can't stand the Federation Klingon alliance, and so it's kind of a throwback. And so, he's great in the episode.
So at that one point, I imagine that on the Klingon homeworld, there are many, many, many Klingons who really hate the alliance with the Federation. So he probably is representative of a majority of Klingons.
I mean, I don't know. As my wife and I are watching through TNG, and, we're in season 4, the middle of it now. I mean, most of the Klingons they run across seem to be fine with it. I mean, I even think of watching when Worf gets his discommendation from the Klingon Empire and everything. The fact that Picard is there are a lot of people a lot of Klingons that kind of stick their noses up at a Starfleet officer, but by the time it's over, a lot of them then have a lot of respect for Picard, which is really interesting. And so, it's one of those things where, we don't We get a lot, of course, about the Klingon Empire in TNG, and then we will get even more in Deep Space Nine in later seasons, which I think is great. And a big part of that becomes, Ronald D. Moore. And so, but no, I don't know. It is an interesting question.
I think of it as I'm thinking of the everyday people who have grown up with this idea that the Federation are the enemies, and it's easier to get people who are actually out there in the forces kind of fall in line, or someone who has that direct observation of how Picard is helping save the Empire to have respect for him. But if I'm thinking of a more realistic and nuanced view of real life, I think that there are probably a lot of people like him, a lot of Klingons like him.
Yeah, there could be. Yeah.
Well, what are your final thoughts for this one, and what's your rating?
Yeah, I think as we mentioned earlier, and I think you did a good job of kind of rightly pinpointing, this is definitely a unique episode for Star Trek and all of Star Trek, actually, because of the way in which it's very, very, very focused. And there's literally nothing to distract you from just the story that they're telling, which I think is a fun risk that they would take. And I honestly end up thinking that it works. I will say, though, the moment with Kira actually does really, I think, hurt the episode. I think that's something where it's like they didn't put enough thought into that. And so I'd probably give this 4 out of 5 missing symbionts. Wow.
So we know where one of them is, but 4 of them are
exactly
AWOL.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I don't have a lot else to say about this episode other than I think the discussion that we had helps me to like the episode more. I think there's a lot of, the world building, the worm building, which we talked about, is very good. And I think it's really fascinating how, because the plot of a story idea, a loose idea, requires you to flesh out something that you've just been kind of dancing around, results in so much more depth being added to the characters. So that's good. The thing about Kira, I know they did it because we couldn't have her overpower Muriel.
Right.
So what I would have done is just not have them fight each other in the first place, just to spare us from the idea that, Kira can't even hold her own here. But it's a minor little thing. Still not one of my favorite episodes, but I think that it's an important one for Jadzia's character development for sure, and for the development of the Trill as a species. So I'm going to give this one 3 bowls of Cenarian egg broth.
Wow.
It's a tasty rating. All right, everyone. We would love to hear your thoughts about invasive procedures. There are many ways for you to share those with us. Perhaps the easiest way is to go to Facebook and join the Babel Conference. That is our listeners group. It's there to extend the conversations beyond the podcasts. So if you're joining for the first time, please do answer the questions and agree to the rules of the forum so that I can let you in. You'll find a post there on the timeline for this episode, and you can share your thoughts with Matthew and me right there, and also with fellow listeners. You can send us email if you prefer to go to our website, trek.fm/contact. Use the form you find there. Choose to send to a show. Choose the orb, and that will come to us by email. And of course, you can find us in social media. Our username everywhere is TrekFM. And if your podcast app of choice allows you to leave a rating and a review, we'd love to get that from you as well. Now, Matthew, when you're not meditating in the docking ring, where can people find you?
Oh, it's just so quiet, peaceful out here, Chris. I just said goodbye to my brother from another mother, and you know how that is. But when I'm not doing that, you can find me all over social media under the name Matt Rushing02. Of course, here on the network, you'll also find me in the 602 Club, talking about all of those franchises outside of Star Trek we love. So join us over there. You also find me over on the Nerd Party Network with a couple of shows. One is a completed show called Owl Post about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series. And then you'll find me doing Aggressive Negotiations with the great John Mills as we talk about Star Wars each and every week. But Chris, when you're not trying to figure out what you're going to do once you get that new symbiont, where can people find you?
All I know is that I'll be bursting with confidence. When I'm not planning that out, you can find me elsewhere on the network doing all those shows with you. You can also find me in the back catalog on many shows. And if you'd like to chat on social media, my username everywhere is C. Bryan Jones. That's the letter C and Bryan with a Y. And if you'd like to help us keep this rewatch and everything we're doing on the network going, we could definitely use your help. To find out how to support us, please visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. We wouldn't be here without your support, so thank you so much to everyone who is supporting us now. Well, Matthew, I'm looking forward to next time when we're going to get to know Garrick a little bit better.
Well, Chris, that sounds great. And thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time as we gaze into the universe.